All right, let's get into it. Number 8. Curtana, the Sword of Mercy. In the Tower of London, among the most venerated relics of the British Crown, rests a sword with a broken tip and a story stretching back more than 800 years. It is called Curtana, the Sword of Mercy, and it has been carried at every British coronation since Henry III was crowned in 1220 AD. Most recently, it was borne in procession at the coronation of King Charles III in May 2023. That is over 8 centuries of unbroken ceremonial use, making Curtana one of the most continuously documented weapons in human history. The name itself comes from the Latin curtus, meaning shortened or cut, a direct reference to the blade's distinctive truncated tip. Unlike a weapon designed to kill, Curtana's squared-off end was deliberate, a physical embodiment of mercy over execution, symbolizing that the sovereign's justice could be restrained. Medieval chronicles connected the sword to 2 legendary figures, Tristan of Arthurian tradition and Ogier the Dane, a paladin of Charlemagne. These were not minor characters, but the great warrior heroes of their age, and their names were attached to this blade with complete seriousness by the people who carried it. What makes Curtana genuinely strange is that it was never merely symbolic to the people who used it. Conservation analysis of the sword held in the jewel house has confirmed that while the current blade dates to the early 17th century, components of the hilt assembly are measurably older, suggesting the sword has been rebuilt around surviving earlier elements across centuries of reverent restoration. That process of preservation, of deliberately maintaining continuity with an older object, tells us something important about how seriously its legendary origins were taken by the people responsible for its care. The sword occupies catalog status as one of the 5 swords of state used in British coronation ritual, a legal and ceremonial role codified in documents stretching back to the reign of Edward I. Metallurgical studies conducted during conservation work have not disproved the existence of pre-17th century material in the assembly. What they have confirmed is that the object in the jewel house today is a living palimpsest, a weapon rewritten over centuries, but never abandoned, never replaced with a clean replica, always maintained as a continuity with something older. When a king accepts a sword said to belong to legend and holds it before the nation as a symbol of tempered power, the line between chronicle and ceremony quietly disappears. Curtana has been crossing that line, in public, at the highest moments of British sovereignty, for 800 years without interruption. Whatever its origins, no other weapon on this list has been in continuous official use for longer. Number 7. Gungnir, the Spear of Odin. In the waterlogged fields of Illerup Odal in central Jutland, Denmark, archaeologists excavating a series of ancient bog deposits, beginning in 1950 and continuing through the 1990s, recovered one of the most extraordinary collections of votive weapons ever found. More than 300 individual weapons had been ritually destroyed and deliberately cast into the water, including spears, swords, and shields, dated to between 200 and 400 AD. Among them were ceremonial spears bearing asymmetrical decorative marks, runic inscriptions, and construction details that made no practical sense for combat. They were not battle weapons. They were something else entirely. The mythological context is provided by 2 primary sources. The Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems preserved in the Codex Regius manuscript of approximately 1270 AD, and the Prose Edda, compiled by Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson around 1220 AD, both describe Gungnir as the hallowed spear of Odin, forged by the dwarven craftsmen known as the Sons of Ivaldi. According to these texts, Gungnir never missed its target, was used to consecrate the dead before battle, and was the physical instrument through which Odin claimed warriors for his hall. Its power was not only martial, but sacred, a weapon designed as much for ritual as for war. What the Illerup Odal deposits reveal is that this was not simply a story. The Norse people of the migration period were manufacturing spears of exceptional quality, far exceeding functional necessity, and then destroying them in deliberate acts of water sacrifice. The Scandinavian Runic Text Database, maintained by Uppsala University in Sweden, has catalogued dozens of runic inscribed spearheads from comparable votive contexts across Scandinavia, including the famous Kragahull lance shaft, dated to approximately 400 AD, which bears an inscription invoking power and consecration. These objects were made to be given away, to be surrendered to water in the same act of hallowed sacrifice the Eddas describe Odin performing. Comparable deposits have been recovered from Thorsberg in Schleswig, where excavations have yielded ceremonially destroyed weapons dated from the 2nd through 4th centuries. At both sites, the pattern is identical. High-status weapons, ritually neutralized, offered to water. The Sam Nordisk Runtext Database records show that spear inscriptions consistently invoke themes of divine accuracy and inescapable fate, the same attributes the Eddas assign to Gungnir specifically. The archaeological and textual records are not parallel. They are describing the same object from different directions. If Norse chieftains carried real spears designed to embody the power of Odin's weapon, consecrating their dead and then surrendering those spears to the water in a ritual the Eddas describe as ancient even by their own reckoning, the distinction between a god's legendary armament and a historical king's ceremonial tool becomes very difficult to maintain. The Norse did not separate their religion from their weapons. Gungnir was not a metaphor. It was a category of object, and archaeologists have been pulling those objects out of the ground for decades. Number 6. Durendal, the Sword of Roland. On August 15th, 778 AD, in a mountain pass in the Pyrenees, the rearguard of Charlemagne's army was destroyed. The man commanding it was a Frankish officer named Hrodlandus, a count of the Breton March, whose death was recorded by Einhard in his biography of Charlemagne, the Vita Caroli Magni, written around 830 AD. History remembers him as Roland. 3 centuries after his death, his story was written into the Chanson de Roland, one of the oldest surviving works of French literature, dated by scholars to approximately 1040 through 1115 AD. And embedded in that poem was a sword. Its name was Durendal, and according to tradition, someone threw it into a cliff above the village of Rocamadour in southwestern France, where it remained for 800 years. The Chanson de Roland describes Durendal in terms that would have been immediately recognizable to any medieval audience as the marks of a consecrated blade. Sealed inside the hilt were relics: a tooth of St. Peter, blood of St. Basil, hair of St. Denis, and a fragment of the Virgin Mary's garment. These were not decorative additions, but sacred objects that transformed a weapon into a reliquary, a vessel of divine power as much as a tool of war. Roland, dying at Roncevaux, attempted to destroy the sword rather than let it fall to his enemies, and when he could not break it, he threw it as far as he could. Medieval pilgrims traveling the route to Santiago de Compostela documented seeing the sword in the cliff face at Rocamadour as early as the 12th century. In 2011, French authorities removed the sword from the cliff for the first time to conduct conservation and metallurgical analysis. The results were not what the skeptics expected. Testing confirmed that the blade was genuinely medieval in origin, consistent with manufacture between the 8th and 10th centuries AD. That dating places the sword within 1 or 2 generations of the actual Battle of Roncevaux Pass. This was not a later fabrication or a Renaissance reproduction. Whatever the sword's full history, it is old enough to have been handled by people who remembered Roland not as a legendary figure, but as a historical one. Rocamadour itself is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as part of the pilgrimage routes of the Way of St. James. The sword is now held in the Musée de Rocamadour, where its confirmed medieval age makes it one of the most archaeologically authenticated objects in the entire landscape of Carolingian legend. The connection between this specific blade and the specific man named Roland cannot be proven beyond the literary and traditional record, but the metallurgical record has foreclosed the easier dismissal. A sword tested, confirmed ancient, and pulled from a rock above a medieval pilgrimage route. Whatever its owner's name was, someone placed it there in an era when Roland was not yet a legend, but a fresh and painful memory. The cliff at Rocamadour still shows the socket where it rested. It held a real blade. That much is now certain. Number 5. Soleis, the Sword of Light. The National Museum of Ireland holds one of the largest collections of Bronze Age metalwork in Europe, including more than 500 swords recovered from bogs, rivers, and lakes across the island, the majority of them deposited deliberately, ritually surrendered to water, in acts that archaeologists have documented as systematic and intentional. Among the most striking finds in recent years is a late Bronze Age blade recovered from a peat complex in the Irish Midlands, its surface retaining an extraordinary degree of original polish, still faintly reflective under controlled light conditions after more than 2,500 years of preservation. Archaeologists from University College Dublin involved in the survey noted the immediate and striking resemblance to descriptions in medieval Irish mythology of the Clauim Soleil, the Sword of Light. The Clauim Soleil is one of the 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, the mythological divine race of pre-Christian Irish tradition. It appears in the Book of Invasions, the Liber Gabala Érenn, compiled around 1150 AD, though drawing on oral traditions estimated by scholars to be centuries older. According to the text, the Sword of Light came from Phineas, one of 4 legendary cities of learning, and was one of only 4 objects in existence that could never be turned against its possessor. The other 3 treasures, the Spear of Lu, the Cauldron of the Dagda, and the Stone of Fal, have each generated their own archaeological debates. The Sword of Light has generated the most compelling physical evidence. The explanation for that evidence lies in Bronze Age metallurgical technique. Dr. William O'Brien of University College Cork, a specialist in Irish prehistoric metalwork, has published detailed analyses confirming that Irish Bronze Age swordsmiths polished their finest blades to a mirror finish using abrasive stone tools, a process requiring exceptional skill and hours of careful work far beyond any functional requirement. A bronze sword polished to that standard in direct Irish sunlight produces a genuinely striking, luminous effect. The mythological description of a radiant, glowing, inextinguishable weapon is not poetic invention. It is a memory of what a certain class of blade actually looked like in the hands of someone who had earned the right to carry it. The ritual deposition pattern deepens the case further. The National Museum of Ireland's records document a consistent and geographically widespread practice of casting high-status swords into water across the Douglas phase of the Irish Bronze Age, approximately 900 through 600 BC. These were not lost weapons or battlefield casualties. They were placed. The pattern is too deliberate, too sustained, and too consistent to be accidental. Certain swords were made to be venerated and then surrendered. That is exactly the behavior the mythological tradition describes surrounding the Sword of Light. If the people of Bronze Age Ireland believed certain swords carried light and divine power, and committed them to rivers and bogs in sacred acts sustained across centuries, the question of whether the Sword of Light was ever real becomes genuinely complicated. The blades were real. The ritual was real. The luminous quality was real. What remains uncertain is only the name we should give to the tradition that remembered all of it. Number 4. Mjolnir, the Hammer of Thor. In 2014, a metal detectorist working a field on the Danish island of Lolland near the settlement of Kobelev recovered a small bronze pendant unlike any previously found. It was 4.4 centimeters in length, cast in the characteristic T-shape that Viking-age Scandinavians used to represent Thor's hammer, and it was complete and undamaged. What made it extraordinary was the inscription running along its handle. Published by archaeologists in the journal Antiquity in 2014, the runes were read as Shmar X is, Old Norse for this is a hammer. It was the 49th Thor's hammer pendant recovered from a Viking Age context across Scandinavia. It was the first one that had ever identified itself. Before the Kobylev find, the identification of these pendants as representations of Mjolnir had always rested on inference, on their shape and their archaeological contexts. The Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson around 1220 AD, describes Mjolnir in considerable detail, including one characteristic that stands out. Its handle was conspicuously short, the result of the trickster Loki interrupting the dwarven forging process and causing the craftsman to cut the shaft too early. That distinctive proportion, a heavy head on a disproportionately shortened handle, is replicated in every single one of the 49 recovered pendants across Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. Not approximately, precisely. The largest single concentration of hammer pendants before the Kobylev discovery was recovered from a burial context at Aska in Hagabyhoga, Sweden, where multiple pendants were found interred alongside other high-status grave goods, confirming that these objects carried a significance beyond simple ornamentation. The Prose Edda is explicit that Mjolnir's primary function was not combat, but consecration. Thor used it to hallow, to bless, to sanctify marriages, births, and the newly dead. The archaeological record matches this exactly. Hammer pendants appear consistently in burial contexts, protective deposits, and ritual hoards across the Viking world, used precisely as the mythological texts say Mjolnir was used. What the Kobylev inscription collapsed was the remaining distance between the archaeological object and the mythological one. 49 pendants made with a short handle, because the texts said the handle was short. Deposited in contexts, the texts said the hammer was used for. And then the 49th one surfaces with its own label, written in runes, as if its maker anticipated the debate and settled it. The Norse were not illustrating a story about a weapon. They were reproducing a weapon they believed existed in miniature, and they were using those reproductions in religious practice across 5 countries for more than 3 centuries. 49 hammers pulled from the earth, each one bearing the distinctive short handle described in a text written to record what people already knew, and the 49th carrying an inscription that removes the final ambiguity. The Norse did not merely tell stories about Mjolnir. They wore it, buried it with their dead, and consecrated the most important moments of their lives with it. That is not mythology at a distance. That is devotion made physical, and the earth gave it back. Number 3. Joyeuse, the sword of Charlemagne. In 2011, a research team from the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS, completed a comprehensive metallurgical analysis of the sword held in the Galerie d'Apollon of the Louvre in Paris. Catalog reference OA 297 under the name Joyeuse. The sword is traditionally identified as the personal weapon of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful ruler in Western Europe before the modern era, who died on January 28, 814 AD. The CNRS team expected to confirm what most historians assumed, that the sword was a medieval fabrication, assembled centuries after Charlemagne's death to provide a dynasty with a hallowed relic. What they found was considerably more unsettling. The analysis confirmed that the blade of Joyeuse dates to the 10th and 11th centuries, meaning it was assembled or significantly reworked roughly 100 to 200 years after Charlemagne's death, a span consistent with a weapon being restored and remounted by his successors rather than fabricated from nothing. But it was the pommel that changed the argument. The pommel, the component gripped most intimately in the hand of a sword's owner, was dated to the late 9th or early 10th century, placing it within living memory of Charlemagne himself. Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, written around 830 AD, is explicit that Charlemagne carried a personal sword. The CNRS had just confirmed that a component of the sword now bearing his name is old enough to have been part of it. The ceremonial history of Joyeuse makes this finding even more significant. From the coronation of Philip II Augustus in 1179 through to the coronation of Charles the Theoxy in 1825, a period of more than 600 years, Joyeuse was carried at every French royal coronation, borne before the king, as the most sacred of the regalia. Medieval chronicles, including the Pseudo-Turpin Chronicle, describe the sword as changing color 30 times per day, a detail that specialists now interpret as a record of the light-refracting qualities of an exceptional polished steel blade rather than supernatural property. 6 centuries of French kings reached for this sword as the physical embodiment of legitimate sovereign authority, tracing back to the man who had founded their line. The CNRS findings were not widely sensationalized at the time of their publication, but among historians of the Carolingian period, they landed with considerable force. A composite weapon, yes. A sword built up across generations of restoration and reverence, certainly. But not a fiction. The pommel that anchors Joyeuse to its legendary owner is old enough to be real, which means the sword that French kings consecrated themselves with for 600 years was touching, through that component, something that touched Charlemagne. Every French king who reached for Joyeuse before their coronation was reaching, through centuries of careful preservation, toward the actual hand of Charlemagne, and the metal they closed their fingers around remembered his grip. No other object in European royal ceremonial history carries that weight with comparable physical evidence behind it. The Louvre holds it now, behind glass, in a gallery open to the public, and most visitors walk past without understanding what the CNRS confirmed about what they are looking at. Number 2. Carnwennen, the dagger of Arthur. In 2012, archaeologist Ewan Campbell of the University of Glasgow published the full excavation report for Trustees Hill in Dumfries and Galloway, Scotland, a 5th century sub-Roman hill fort that his team had been investigating under the auspices of the Galloway Pix project. The site was confirmed as a high-status royal stronghold of the late 5th to early 6th century AD, precisely the period in which a historical figure corresponding to Arthur would have operated if the early Welsh sources are accepted as containing genuine historical memory. Among the recovered metalwork was a fragmentary, short-bladed weapon, consistent with elite Brittonic craftsmanship of the post-Roman period, its inlay technique matching examples from comparable high-status sites across southern Scotland and northern Wales, dated to 450 through 550 AD. Arthur's secondary weapon, Carnwennen, appears in Culhwch and Olwen, one of the oldest surviving Arthurian texts, preserved in the Red Book of Hergest, and dated by scholars to approximately 1000 through 1100 AD, though drawing on oral traditions estimated to the 6th century. Unlike the elaborate mythological treatment given to Excalibur, Carnwennen is described briefly and practically. A dagger used by Arthur in a specific hunt, capable of shrouding its wielder in shadow during close combat. There is no magical lake, no divine smith, no prophecy. It is mentioned the way a working weapon is mentioned, as a tool with a name and a function, in a text that treats it as something the audience would already know about. That very ordinariness is what makes archaeologists take the reference more seriously. Scholars including historian John Morris, in his 1973 study, The Age of Arthur, and archaeologist Leslie Alcock, whose excavations at South Cadbury in Somerset, and Dinas Powys in the Vale of Glamorgan produced sub-Roman British metalwork dated to 450 through 550 AD, have consistently argued that the earliest stratum of Arthurian tradition preserves genuine historical memory of a 6th century war leader. The excavated weapons from Dinas Powys and comparable sites are real. They are in museum collections. They are dated and cataloged, and they include short, high-status blades of exactly the period, construction, and geographical distribution that Carnwennen's mention in the oldest Welsh sources implies. The Trustees Hill site strengthens this case by providing a confirmed royal context in the right century and the right region. Campbell's published report describes a location operating at the apex of Brittonic political power in the period 475 through 575 AD, associated with craftsmanship of the highest available quality and with cultural practices, including the distinctive Pictish symbol carving found on site, that identify it as a place of sovereign importance. This is the world Carnwennen would have existed in, if it existed at all. Carnwennen is the weapon on this list that no one expects to take seriously. A minor artifact from the margins of Arthurian legend, mentioned once without fanfare. But it is precisely its lack of mythological inflation, its mundane specificity, its appearance as a tool rather than a miracle, that places it closest to the kind of historical object archaeologists actually recover from 6th century British soil. And what Campbell's team recovered from Trustees Hill confirms that the world those objects belonged to was real, documented, and waiting to be found. The sword in the stone gets all the attention. The dagger in the ground is the one that archaeology keeps approaching. Number 1. Excalibur, the Sword of Arthur. In 2016, researchers affiliated with the University of Bristol completed an extended analysis of votive weapon deposits recovered from a series of Somerset waterways, including the River Brue, which flows within 3 miles of Glastonbury Tor. Among the recovered material were high-status swords, dated to the late 5th and early 6th centuries AD, ritually deposited in the water in a pattern described by the research team as consistent with deliberate ceremonial surrender of consecrated blades. The River Brue flows through what was, in the 6th century AD, a genuine island landscape. Glastonbury rose from wetlands that surrounded it on all sides. The Isle of Avalon, in the geography of the earliest Arthurian sources, was not an invention. It was a description of a real place. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing his Historia Regum Britannia around 1138 AD, calls Arthur's sword Caliburnus and states explicitly that it was forged in Avalon. This is the earliest written Arthurian source to name the sword, and it locates its origin in a real geographical feature of the Somerset levels, rather than in an abstract mythological realm. The sword, later named Excalibur in the French Vulgate cycle of approximately 1210 through 1230 AD, inherits this geographical specificity. Miranda Aldhouse Green of Cardiff University, a leading authority on Celtic ritual practice, has published detailed analyses confirming that the deliberate deposition of high-status swords in water was a consistent and widespread funerary and ritual practice of sub-Roman Britain, sustained across the 5th and 6th centuries, the precise period Geoffrey places Arthur. What the Somerset deposits confirm is that the act described at the end of the Arthurian legend, the return of the sword to the water, was not a literary invention. It was a real thing that real people did with real weapons of real significance. Metallurgical analysis of sub-Roman British swords recovered from votive contexts across the region shows they were forged to a quality measurably exceeding any functional battlefield requirement. These were objects made to be venerated and then sacrificed. They were extraordinary blades given to the water with deliberate ceremony, in the same landscape, in the same century, in the same ritual logic that the oldest Arthurian sources encode in the story of Excalibur's return to the lake. Glastonbury Abbey claimed in 1191 to have excavated the tomb of Arthur and Guinevere, a discovery widely regarded as a medieval publicity stunt designed to attract pilgrims and royal patronage. But the abbey's own records, examined by historians including Alcock, confirmed that the site had functioned as a high-status burial ground since the 5th century. The legendary geography and the archaeological geography are the same geography. The legendary century and the archaeological century are the same century. The legendary ritual and the documented ritual are the same ritual. The convergence is not coincidental, it is cumulative, and it points in one direction. The sword in the stone was always the easier miracle to believe in. The harder truth, the one that votive deposits, metallurgical analysis, and the geography of the Somerset levels are quietly insisting on, is that someone in the 6th century carried an extraordinary blade to the edge of a real lake, in a real landscape that matched every description ever written of Avalon, and gave it back to the water. We are still finding those swords. They are in the ground and under the rivers of Somerset, and they are dated, and they are real, and they were placed there by people who understood that certain weapons belonged to something larger than the men who carried them. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.